Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line of the Russo-Ukrainian war. It's your host Weeb Union and let's get straight into it. We start out in the Zaporizhzhia front where we here see a Russian small advance in the forest area here to the south of Robotyne. The Russians are looking to envelop the Ukrainian fortifications here to the south of the village, where they have the positions to the north of it, and now with an infantry assault group crossing through the forest areas to the east of it, there is no exit for the Ukrainians without direct combat with the Russians. If there are any Ukrainians left in the fortifications to the south of the village, they are now operationally encircled. However, it is more likely that the Ukrainians have left the area rather than them still being present in the area and have simply left prior to this offensive operation by the Russians. And with this, we see that positional fighting continues here to the south of Robotyne, where the Russians are looking to gain full control over the fortifications and push onwards to the Ukrainian fortifications to the east and to the north of the village. Slightly to the east in the direction of Verbove, the Russians are pushing onwards to the Ukrainian fortifications to the northwest of the village, ahead of the Surovikin line. After recapturing the Surovikin line, the Russians have started pushing towards the Ukrainian fortifications to the east of Robotyne in the salient that the Ukrainians managed to gain during their summer offensive, as Russians are slowly pushing back the Ukrainian forces. It seems that the Russians are having as much difficulties fighting in this section of the front line as the Ukrainians did. The only difference is that the Russians didn't launch any massive armored assault in this section of the front line, which means that they learned from the mistake the Ukrainians did during their summer offensive, which ended up as a disaster, and since then the Ukrainians switched to the small assault groups, which allowed them to gain significant advances with much less casualties during that time, and the Russians have just done nothing but that since the start of their counterattack. We'll then move on to the next section of the front line here to the direction of Novomykhailivka, where the Russians have advanced here in the northern parts of the town, where they've managed to gain control over the northeastern part of it. And with this, the Russians now have full control over the eastern part of Novomykhailivka, as fighting will reach the central parts here in the coming days. And there's also advancement by the Russians here to the north in an attempt to gain control over the roads going into Novomykhailivka from the north. The Russians have here been focusing on positional fighting to allow them to advance within the central parts and northern and southern parts of the town. However, their advancements have been very slow as they have faced a lot of difficulties facing off against the Ukrainian defenders. And the advantages the defenders have in this war seems to be extremely significant based on the fortifications, minefields, and other aspects that allow the defending force to destroy an attacking force prior to them actually arriving at the front line. However, as soon as the arriving force actually arrives, they are able to actually battle and push out the defending force. The main reason for that is there is a discrepancy in the firepower. Right now, we're seeing the Russians try to push towards the Ukrainian positions while under fire, not to mention having to push through fortifications and minefields, which makes it very difficult for them to actually reach the front line. We'll then move on to the northwest of Avdiivka, where the Russians have made two small advancements, one to the north of Berezhyi and one to the east of Semenivka. It is reported that the Russians have managed to gain a foothold within Semenivka, with infantry assault groups entering and infiltrating the village to then start fighting in the first buildings where the Russians have gained a foothold. However, it is unclear whether or not they will hold it, so the area stays as a gray zone for now. In the north by Berezhyi, the Russians are making small advancements towards the Ukrainian fortifications to the north of the village, where the Russians are looking to gain control of them to cut off the main supply route in and out of Berezhyi. Looking at the roads, we see there are no other roads than the ones to the north and to the west here of Berezhyi and Semenivka. If the Russians cut off the road to the north, the only road would be west of Semenivka. Moving on to the next section of the front line to the northwest of Bakhmut, the Russians have made a significant advance here within Bakhmut, considering the lack of advances in the area. Them restarting the operations here and advancing within the village is a significant development. To the north of it, there's been a very small advancement in the forest area, which signifies positional fighting, but no significant developments. And with this, we see that the Russians are now focusing on the northern part of the flank of Bakhmut, rather than the southern part, with some positional fighting taking place within Klishivka and advances weeks in the making. The northern parts are now showing that the Russians are focusing on reaching the canal line here to the west of Bakhmut first before the northern and southern areas of the front line. So with this, we see that there is a push through Bakhmut. This is taking place under heavy cover fire by the Russian artillery and air force, allowing them to bombard the Ukrainian positions and then advance towards the Ukrainian fortifications. It's likely that the Russians will push through the central parts of Avdiivka until they get into close proximity with the Ukrainian fortifications, which will significantly slow down the Russian advances. This is why heavy fighting is taking place, and there's only small advances here to the north of Avdiivka due to its close proximity with the Ukrainian fortifications, and there's likely a lot of Ukrainian positions within the forest patch. The Ukrainians have in this war shown that they're extremely capable in defense, but it's questionable how effective they are on the offense, with mixed results. The Kharkiv offensive was a success due to the collapse of the Russian lines in the north. The Kherson offensive was a success due to the forced withdrawal of the Russians across the Dnieper River. The Zaporizhzhia offensive and Bakhmut counteroffensive were both failures, which shows that recently they haven't had a lot of success, while in the start, before the Russians mobilized and created the defensive positions, they had a lot more success. Now that the front line is much more even after the Russian mobilization and the building of their fortifications, the initiative has mainly been on the Russian side, where the Russians have managed to make net advances over the past few months. However, those are very small, similar to when the Ukrainians launched their own offensive. The difference is the Ukrainians committed a significant amount of their forces, while the Russians didn't. And if we take a look at casualties, it should be significantly in favor of the Russians due to the Russian firepower advantage and air superiority. We're seeing that the Russian Air Force has significantly increased its effectiveness. Combining this with the significant advantage the Russians have when it comes to ammunitions in artillery, they should have a significant firepower advantage, which the Ukrainian response is mainly focused around its own artillery, air defense, and FPV drones, where the most effective is the FPV drones. The Ukrainian air defense has recently significantly weakened due to the destruction of many Patriot launchers and other systems across the front, as the Ukrainians brought them closer to the front to deal with the Russian Air Force. However, the Russian Air Force had detected them and launched both long-range missiles and bombings towards these air launchers, which allowed the Russians to destroy them. And with this, the Ukrainian air defense has weakened, not to mention the lack of ammunition there. However, the Ukrainians have significantly developed their ability to deal with Russian drones. The Commander-in-Chief of the US Air Force in Europe, James Hecker, explained how the Ukrainian Shahed detection system works. They created a system where they put microphones on sticks all over Ukraine to track drones, which tracks their location, their direction, and allows the Ukrainians to shoot them down. This Ukrainian strategy actually allows them to save on expensive missiles to then just shoot down these drones with anti-aircraft artillery, like the Gepard tanks that they got from Germany. At the same time, there was a strike that was reported to have taken place here to the south of Zaporizhzhia Yar. In the area right here, it was reported that there was an underground bunker for generals and advisors for the Ukrainian army, and the Russians struck this with some bunker buster missiles, destroying the bunker and allegedly killing all the generals inside. And following the exact time the strike took place, Polish media started reporting on the death of Brigadier General Adam Marczak is dead. They report that he died of natural causes suddenly at the same time as this strike took place. So Russian sources are claiming that the strike took place and destroyed NATO generals, including this Polish general advising the Ukrainian army. There is, of course, no way to confirm or deny this claim. In regards to the upcoming Russian offensive that is expected to be a massive one, the Ukrainians are preparing by building fortifications and increasing its defense capabilities. When it comes to the defense capabilities, Ukraine ramps up spending on homemade weapons to help repel Russia. However, some issues have been found, and one of them is that the Ukrainian armored vehicles plant director complains about the lack of qualified workers, since everyone was taken away by the mobilization office. So he's saying that the majority of the workforce that are qualified to build these tanks, build these vehicles, have been mobilized to the Ukrainian army. At the same time, prior to the Ukrainian summer offensive, the Ukrainian army grew overconfident and expected the Russian lines to collapse and their summer offensive to succeed. So they didn't really focus too much on building their own fortifications beyond the original lines they had in 2014. However, currently Ukraine is in a race against time to fortify its front line. Their summer offensive failed, the Russian offensive is expected, and due to this they need to build their own fortifications. However, it was significantly delayed, and it only started recently after the winter season ended and the ground stopped being frozen to allow these vehicles to work and dig these trenches, build these fortifications. However, it is suffering from shortage of ammunitions and manpower, making it again difficult due to the lack of qualified personnel to build these fortifications. So the work is going slow despite all the money in the world being dedicated to it. Western countries now expect the Ukrainian lines could collapse during this summer offensive of the Russians. If that happens, the Ukrainians could lead the entirety of the eastern bank of the Dnieper River in Russian hands if their front line collapses, or it could even completely lose the war. I'm not going to make a prediction because I've made plenty of those. There's videos out there over the past few weeks where I've made predictions as to what, how, and everything about the summer offensive, so you can check those out. And therefore, I'll end this video here. Thank you all for watching. Hope you all enjoyed. Leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon. And most of all, have a great day.